La Facultad de Historia, Geografía y Ciencia Política de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile les da la más cordial bienvenida y les agradece su presencia a la tercera edición de nuestra Cátedra Puerto de Ideas-UC, que en esta oportunidad recibirá a la historiadora Margaret MacMillan. Preside la actividad la decana de nuestra facultad, Valeria Palanza, la presidenta de la Fundación Puerto de Ideas, Chantal Signorio, la directora de la Fundación Puerto de Ideas y profesora titular del Instituto de Historia, Olaya Sanfuentes. Nos distinguen además con su asistencia los directores de los institutos que integran nuestra facultad, académicos y académicas de la Universidad Católica, estudiantes y todos y todas quienes nos acompañan. Para dar comienzo a esta actividad, invitamos a nuestra decana a entregar las palabras de bienvenida.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Qué gusto ver la sala completa. Para los que están de pie, yo desde acá veo varios asientos, así que se podrían acomodar. Qué gusto poder hoy darle la bienvenida a Margaret MacMillan. Quiero contarles acerca de la cátedra Puerto de Ideas-UC, que es fruto de una alianza de nuestra facultad con la Fundación Puerto de Ideas. Y cada año, algunos ya saben, llevamos adelante una conferencia con destacados intelectuales del mundo, ¿sí? Con la idea de compartir experiencias y contenidos sobre temáticas innovadoras a través de expositores y expositoras de renombre. La presentación de Margaret MacMillan se suma a la realizada en sus dos ediciones anteriores, algunas recordarán, en el 2021 por Marta Nussbaum y en el 2022, el año pasado, por Dipesh Chakrabarty. Margaret MacMillan es profesora emérita de Historia en la Universidad de Toronto y de Historia Internacional en la Universidad de Oxford. Fue rectora del Trinity College de Toronto de 2002 a 2007. Fue directora de St. Anthony's College de Oxford de 2007 a 2017 y es fideicomisaria del Museo Imperial de la Guerra del Reino Unido. Su presencia aquí enaltece nuestra cátedra. La profesora MacMillan es una reconocida experta en relaciones internacionales, ha publicado varios libros y numerosos artículos sobre la diplomacia mundial contemporánea. Su investigación se especializa en la historia imperial británica y la historia internacional de los siglos XIX y XX. Sus publicaciones han sido traducidas a 26 idiomas. Así que no voy a decir más, porque creo que con este último dato ya he dicho mucho, y el profesor Reppening después va a hablar más en detalle sobre la biografía de la profesora MacMillan. Quiero agradecer a la profesora MacMillan su presencia en Chile y en nuestro campus, es un honor para nosotros. También quiero agradecer a la Fundación Puerto de Ideas y especialmente a Chantal Signorino, la presidenta de la Fundación, que también nos acompaña, y quiero agradecer también esta colaboración que venimos sosteniendo. Muchas gracias, Chantal. También quiero agradecer a Olaya Sanfuentes, a Claudio Role y a Diego Reppening por el apoyo en la organización. Espero que todos y todas puedan disfrutar de esta conferencia que nos dará la profesora MacMillan y después poder tener una interesante conversación con ella. Disfruten.
Buenas. También agradecer a todos y a todas la asistencia. Nos da mucha felicidad que el auditorio esté lleno y que haya suscitado tanto interés en la actividad del día de hoy. La decana ya hizo una introducción más o menos acabada acerca acerca de la trayectoria de nuestra invitada del día de hoy. Como les decía, es profesora emérita de la Universidad de Toronto, ahí sí, y de la Universidad de Oxford, ¿cierto? Tiene una larga trayectoria, por supuesto, publicando libros como los que pueden encontrar afuera, ¿cierto? 1914, La guerra que terminó la paz, acerca de la conferencia de 1919, acerca de la historia de la gente. Tiene un libro acerca de biografías, acerca de grandes personajes del siglo XX y últimamente la más reciente publicación acerca de la guerra y cómo el conflicto nos ha formado. Como lamentablemente sabemos, ¿cierto? La guerra es un tema que ha adquirido relevancia en los últimos años y eso nos obliga, de alguna forma u otra, como gente vinculada al quehacer académico, a involucrarnos con este tema. Y en ese sentido creo que las palabras que hoy día nos va a ofrecer Margaret nos van a permitir iluminar algunos aspectos de este tema al cual no quisiéramos referirnos, pero que lamentablemente se hace urgente hacerlo. Entonces, para no aburrirlos más y comenzar con las palabras de Margaret, los dejo con Margaret MacMillan.
Thank you, and I apologize for not speaking Spanish, but I will try and speak slowly in English. And I would like to thank the dean and the professor because I think I know enough Spanish to know that they were saying nice things about me. So thank you very much for those introductions. I want to talk today about history and war, and perhaps start by saying why I think we need to be interested in war. And the shortest answer is one that comes, funnily enough, from Leon Trotsky, who said, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And I think that is true of history for much of humanity's long period on this earth, also true of the present. And I think history is something that is useful. I do history because I love doing it. I find it interesting. I find it fun. But I think it can also help us think about the present. What history can do is help us to understand other people, what motivates them, what they remember, what they wish for. I think if you don't understand the history of Russia, you don't understand what Russia is doing today. If you don't understand the history of Israel and the Palestinian people, you don't understand what's happening in the Middle East today. And so history, I think, can help with understanding. It also helps with understanding ourselves, because we tell ourselves lovely stories about ourselves, about how nice we are and how awful other people are. I'm Canadian, Canadians tell themselves stories about what a gentle people we are. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a Canadian game of hockey on the ice, so you know what I mean. We have illusions about ourselves, and I think that's where history can be helpful. History, I think, can also be useful in challenging the bad histories that people often have. When people say history means that we, China, have always owned Taiwan, we can challenge that because it's not true. And so knowing history helps to challenge claims that are being made in the present. And it helps us to ask good questions. It won't give us clear answers. It won't give us lessons. It won't give us, well, it gives us lessons, but it won't give us blueprints. It won't give us prospectuses of what we should be doing. But it will help us, as other disciplines like political science and anthropology, literature, will help us think about the present and help us deal with the problems we face in the present. And so that's why I think, among other things, studying the history of war can be helpful in trying to understand what is happening today in the world and what the prospects of more or less war are going to be. I define war in a fairly narrow way. It's a word that's used very widely. You know, we have wars on poverty, we have wars on obesity, we have wars on drugs. I once read a book which was called My War on My Husband's Cholesterol. Now that's too wide a definition. I look at war as something that is highly organized, one of the most organized of all human endeavors. You think of the organization that goes into assembling an armed force, giving it equipment, training the people in it, and moving it from here to there. I mean, this is highly organized. And I also look at war as that organization using violence to get what it wants. It has goals. The people's fighting, whether they are groups of people, ethnic groups, civil wars, people fighting in civil wars, or whether it's state to state, they have a purpose. And so that's my definition of war. Highly organized violence to get the other side to do what you want for a particular purpose. And I think I will keep to that definition. So today we are looking perhaps at more war than we thought we would be looking at. The war in Ukraine was a shock, I think, not just for Europeans, but a shock that has been felt in different parts of the world, because it is, for the first time, actually, for quite a long time, an aggression taken by one state, unprovoked. I think Russia had no reason to attack Ukraine, whatever President Putin may say, and it was unprovoked to seize land from Ukraine. It was a war of conquest like the wars we saw in the 19th century, the wars we saw in the 18th century, the wars we saw earlier. And so it has made us think yet again about the international order and the fragility of that order. Because since 1945, there has been a sort of understanding that you cannot, as a state, take the territory of other states by force. The people living there have to have a voice, there has to be an international agreement, and that has now been breached. And what Putin has done, the road he has taken, will be a road that will be followed by other states as they see an advantage in attacking their neighbors and seizing territory. And so it's a war, I think, that even if we're not directly involved, we need to think very seriously about. Why we also need to think very seriously about war is that it is much more capable of reaching around the world than it used to be. You know, Chile has been fortunate, my own country, Canada, has been fortunate, a lot of the Americas have been fortunate, is that they are protected by their geography. We have oceans on either side, and you have the Antarctic, we have the Arctic. And so we have been somewhat protected by geography, and that's no longer the case. When you think of how quickly missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, can fly around the world, and you think of what's happening in space, space is not meant to be militarized. There are actually treaties governing that, but more and more war is moving into space. And if you notice, the military of the big powers, the United States, now has a separate space command, because the capacity to position killer satellites, killer rockets in space, and then drop them anywhere you wish in the world is now enormous. So we have to worry about war because its capacity, not just for destruction, but its capacity to reach out is now very much greater than it has been. Let me just give you one statistic. I won't give you many, but this is one I think that is important. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, the atom bomb, in 1945, was probably between 15 and 20 kilotons. So just think of that, it destroyed a whole city. Today, the great powers, the United States, China, Russia, possess bombs that are 80 times stronger. Imagine what that would do. If one small bomb, as it was, can destroy the whole city of Hiroshima, what would something 80 times greater do? It is a terrifying thing to think of. And there are probably 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world, perhaps more, we don't know. But our capacity now for destruction is very great. There's a very famous biologist called E.O. Wilson who said, I think quite rightly, he said, we have Paleolithic emotions. We have emotions that date back to the Stone Age. We have medieval institutions. We have institutions which come out of the past and are not always fit for the present. And we have a godlike technology. And as he said, it is terrifically dangerous. And I think this is why we have to think about war, and we have to think about the possibilities of future wars, because there are, as we know, a number of crises points in the world. That's a satellite listening to us. And you think of the tensions between the United States and China, or the tensions which people don't pay enough attention to between China and India. You know, I think there are the possibilities. And we in Canada have never forgotten that the United States once declared war on us. So you never know, we may decide one day to take back some of the territory they took from us. I'm joking, I don't think we will, but I'm sorry about this. Perhaps if I stand quietly. So is our future more war? And this both looks to the future, this question, but it also takes us back to a very old question, which has been asked really back into the Greek times, the classical times. Are we condemned to fight? Is there something about human beings that makes us want to fight each other? And this is a very old debate, and I don't have an answer because it's a debate I think that continues, and there is no clear answer. Did we, before we began to organize ourselves into groups, before we began to fight each other, did we live in harmony with each other? And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, would say, yes, we did. That there was a world once where people lived, they farmed together, they lived happily, they were hunter-gatherers, they went out hunting together, they did not fight each other because there was enough space and there were enough resources for everyone. And the other view, again represented by a philosopher, in this case the English philosopher Hobbes, said no, the early world was full of anarchy and violence because there was no central control, there was no one to stop you from attacking your neighbors. I don't know. I think all I can say is I don't know. I think greater organization can bring greater peace, but it can also bring greater capacity for making war. The other side of the argument, which goes on about are we condemned to fight, is there something in our biology? Have we got impulses that make us want to do violence to others? Are we still, as E.O. Wilson, the biologist, would say, are we still the creatures of the Stone Age? Have we really changed? Has biology left us with aggressive impulses? My own view is not. Biology has left us, evolution has left us with a lot of things. It's also left us with altruism. It's left us with the capacity to love others and want to protect others and to work with others. And so I don't think evolution and biology alone will explain why we fight each other and why we organize ourselves to fight. And when you think of how often people have to be persuaded to fight, I don't think it's a natural thing. I don't think most people want to go out and fight. I think people sometimes in bars or at football matches will get a bit excited and want to throw things at each other and pour beer over each other. But that's uncontrolled random violence. It's not the organized violence of war. And if you want to take, if the Army or the Navy or the Air Force here wanted to take any one of you and make you in to a soldier or a sailor or a pilot, it would take a lot of training. And a lot of you would find it very difficult to come around to be the sort of people, to see yourselves as the sort of people who want to fight and inflict violence on others. And so I would argue that fighting war is a highly social organization, and that what is extremely important is not just, I think in fact they're not very important, our biological impulses. What is extremely important is culture, the values and the training and the ways in which we get people to fight. And we know that there are societies that have been more military, more warlike than other societies. The ancient Spartans in the classical world expected that their young men would fight. The young men were often taken away from their families when they were quite young. These were only young men of the upper classes. And they were put into training camps and they were taught to fight. And their families encouraged this. It is said, it may not be true, but it's a good story, like a lot of stories from the classical world. It is said that Spartan mothers would say to their sons when they went off to fight, come home with your shield, because it was a terrible dishonor to lose your shield, or carried on it, or don't come home at all. You know, if you lose your shield in battle, we don't want to see you ever again. You've been a shame to us. If you come home dead, carried on your shield, that's okay. And that was the message of the mothers. When we think of mothers wanting to protect the lives of their children, no. In this case, they wanted their sons to be honorable and be prepared to die in battle. And we've seen other societies like that. Prussia, the German state, which really built itself through its army. In fact, Prussia was a poor little backward state with scattered territories in the north of Germany in the 17th century. By the 19th century, it was the center of the modern Germany. It was a joke always about Prussia, that Prussia is not a country that happens to have an army. It's an army that happens to have a country. Because what made Prussia so strong was its army. But again, there was a culture. Young men of certain families, the upper class families, were expected to go into the military. That was the only honorable thing to do. And if you couldn't go into the military, you went into work for the government in some other way. but the idea of going into business or the academic world was not something that was valued in that society. And so I think myself that culture makes a huge difference to why societies fight. And even in peaceful democratic societies, we have learnt ways of training young people. It has been mostly men in the past, but now increasingly it is women who are doing the fighting as well. But we have learnt ways of training people to make them into the sort of people who are prepared to take orders, who are prepared to risk their own lives, and prepared to take the lives of other people. And so any society has had, almost any society has had to face this. And we also notice, and that is encouraging me, that some societies that are very warlike change over time. Sweden was one of the most warlike societies in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. If you lived anywhere in Europe and you heard the Swedish army was coming, you ran because they were so awful and so violent and so deadly. And now what do we think of Sweden? We think of a country where people make their own IKEA furniture. They go to the woods and they pick berries. They are very peaceful now. But culture, I think, plays a huge part there. Sweden has changed. It's become a very different sort of place. And so the old debate, it won't be settled, but it is a debate that will go on. Why do we fight? But it seems to be the case that we fight because our cultures persuade us to fight. We fight because we believe in something. Belief is often important. People will fight because they believe in a religion, or they believe in an ideology, or they believe in a cause of some force. Nationalism is a very strong motivator of why people fight. If you think you belong to a nation, it's something bigger than you. It existed before you. It will exist if you do the right things after you. So it is a cause. You are part of something much greater than you. And we know that people will die for causes. And they will also, as we've seen with Hamas, commit appalling atrocity for causes because they are thinking that they are building something better. They have a purpose in mind, often a purpose which will lead them into unspeakable cruelties. And so people fight for a number of reasons. Well, peoples fight. I would argue there are probably four main reasons. Well, three big ones and then a possible fourth. One is greed. You want something that someone else has. And so you organize yourself to take it. You organize yourself to take over territory. You organize yourself to seize treasure. You organize yourself to seize treasure ships at sea if they're coming from the New World to the Old World in the 16th and 17th centuries. Greed, I think, is a great motivator. I think fear is another motivator. You sometimes fight because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't fight. You are afraid of what your neighbor is planning. I would argue that part of the reason Germany went to war in the First World War was because it was afraid of Russia. Russia was growing very fast indeed. It had far more people than Germany did, which meant far more potential soldiers. It was building railways very fast, and the railways were coming towards the German borders. In those days, Germany and Russia had a shared border. And so the Germans were motivated partly to go to war because they wanted to stop Russia before it got any stronger. The German military argued, they said, if we don't fight Russia in 1914, we will not be able to fight them by 1917. It's very much the same argument the Japanese used when they attacked the United States in 1941. If we don't fight them now, we never will be able to fight them. And so I think fear can lead you into war as much as greed can. And then there is the thing I mentioned, ideology, ideas, passions. These things, as we know, can be enormously powerful. And I would argue the fourth thing, which perhaps is less important, but still matters, I've been thinking about this since the Ukraine war started, is you sometimes go to war because you think you can get away with it. And I think President Putin looked at Ukraine and he said, they're a divided country, and Ukrainian politics was very messy. They don't have many tanks. We have lots of tanks. They don't have many artillery. We have lots of field guns. They don't have many airplanes. We have lots of airplanes. He looked at the numbers and he said, there's no way Ukraine can resist us. Ukraine will not fight. And it was, as we know, a huge miscalculation, but he thought he was going to get away with it. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, they actually had planned for a victory parade within about a week. The officers who were coming down in the columns that invaded Ukraine had brought their special dress uniforms for the military parade. And the Russian secret police had already chosen which nice apartments they would take over in Kyiv to live in. So they simply assumed that Ukraine was finished. And so I think all these, if we're talking about Putin, all these different motivating factors are actually there. Often you get a combination of factors. He thought it was easy. He wanted something from Ukraine, so there was greed. He wanted Ukrainian territory, he wanted Ukrainian resources, a lot of which were concentrated in the eastern part of Ukraine. And he was afraid. He was afraid that if Ukraine broke out of the Russian control, broke out of the Russian sphere of influence and moved towards the West, and it was moving towards the West. It was applying to join the European Union. It wanted to join NATO. It was moving in a more democratic direction. And what he feared was that if Ukraine could do it, there might be people in Russia thinking the same thing. You know, why can't we have this? If you were in Russia, you look at Ukraine, it's prosperous, it's part of the Western world, it's moving in a democratic direction. And so really, I think it was greed, fear, ideology comes into it as well, because Putin had this view, which I think is completely wrong, that Ukraine doesn't exist. It's not really a country. It has no character. It is always and should always be part of Russia. I don't know how many of you read the essay that President Putin wrote. It's called Ukrainians. In English, it's called Ukrainians and Russians Are One People. And he wrote it in the summer, I think, of 2021. And you used to be able to find it on the Kremlin website in English. Last time I looked, it's been taken down. Someone asked me if I was grading it, if I was giving it a mark, if he was a student of mine, what I would do. And I said, well, I'm very kind, so I wouldn't fail it, because I don't like failing students. But I'd say, Vladimir, you really need to look at the evidence, and you cannot draw these conclusions. There's no logic here. So I would have given it, just a pass. Today I might fail it. But so I think in Putin's case, there were these four motivations mixed up with each other. The awful thing about war is it comes sometimes when you don't, well, there are many awful things about war. And what happens, I think, in war, and this is what Putin is now discovering, is that once you start, it's often very difficult to stop. War has its own, as Clausewitz, the great German military philosopher, said, war has its own logic. It follows its own rules. You think you can start something, you think you can stop it when you want to. You can't stop wars easily. And you cannot predict always where they're going to go. When the alliance of the United States and Britain invaded Iraq in what they thought would be a very short operation, they didn't know they were going to end up having an occupation. They found themselves in something that they couldn't control, and it took them a very long time, as we know, to get out. Same thing when NATO invaded Afghanistan. Again, it was going to be a quick and easy operation to get rid of the Taliban. 20 years later, a great many lives lost later, it was a very different story. So starting a war may be one thing. You may intend to fight a very nice short war. It's not always going to turn out that way. In fact, it usually doesn't. You've probably all heard the stories about how the soldiers went off to fight in 1914 in the First World War. And they said to their families, we'll be home for Christmas, see you at Christmas. Well, by Christmas, a great many of them were dead. And the war, of course, lasted for 4 years. Having said that, and I think we understand the horrors of war, I want to also point to another paradox about war, and that is it sometimes produces, unintentionally, but it sometimes produces good results. You could argue, Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, argued that in fact wars that built a stronger state in the long run were beneficial for society, because a stronger state can create conditions within which industry, investment, livelihoods, the arts can flourish, that a strong state can repel attacks from outside. Now, you don't have to agree with this, but I think it is the case that the development of the state has been very much tied up with war. In fact, there's a very famous book by Charles Tilly called War Made the State and the State Made War. And it's almost something that rolls like a ball. The stronger the state, the more it can squeeze resources out of its society. It can train the soldiers, train the people at sea, build the ships. All of this is very expensive and always was expensive. And once it has done that, it can then acquire more territory because it has the capacity to do it. And so a lot of what we see in the modern state is really a product of war. Taking a census, that really started in the 19th century because governments wanted to count how many young men they had who could fight. It became part of how governments operated. Increased taxation and more efficient taxation. That again had a lot to do with war. Because if you can't get the money you need, if you can't find out who's got money, if you can't get them to pay it over to the government, then you're not going to be able to fight a war. And so the growth of an efficient and strongly centralized state is very much tied up with war. It's not the way we would choose to do it, and we may think that strong and central states aren't a good thing, but war has had a profound impact on societies. Just as societies have had a profound impact on war, different societies fight wars in different ways, and often the ways in which they fight are affected by the nature of society. Some societies don't value war, they try and avoid it, or they will fight token wars. The peoples of the Central Americas, the Aztecs, the Maya, used to fight what people have called the flower wars, where you would have a day of combat and then you'd stop. One side or the other would have lost, but you didn't try to destroy the other side totally. It was, in a way, an outlet for aggression, but it was not something that went further. Democracies have had to fight wars in different ways because they have had to persuade their own people that the war is worth fighting. In doing that, they've also had to give their own people more. And so at the end of the Second World War, the British government recognized that the ordinary British, the people living in the cities, the people living in the ports, the people who had contributed so much to the war effort were owed something because they had suffered, they had made the war possible. And so the new Labour government in 1945 brought in the welfare state. And that was very much a product of the Second World War. Even during the war, the British government was talking about it, saying we have to do something. We have to do something for pensions, for healthcare, for the general standard of living of the lower classes in our country. At the end of the First World War, a number of countries democratic countries, gave women the vote. Most countries didn't vote before the First World War. The argument was made that they were too silly. They were in the household, they didn't understand world affairs, they didn't understand government, or that in any case, if you gave women the vote, they'd just vote as their husbands told them, so what was the point? You just get twice as many votes. Well, of course, that argument no longer made sense after the First World War because women contributed so much to the war effort. Women went to work in the factories, they went to do all sorts of jobs that people had said they couldn't do before. And so at the end of the war, even in some cases before the war ended, a number of countries gave women and the working classes the vote because it was recognized that they had been very important in the war effort. And so this complicated relationship, societies fight wars in certain ways because of what they are, but wars also change societies. And there's been an argument made recently by a couple of economic historians, including Thomas Piketty, the great French economic historian, that the two world wars led to greater equality in the societies that fought them, because the rich had to pay taxes. They couldn't escape to the West Indies or somewhere. They had to pay their taxes. And the poor got more benefits. And so there was greater social cohesion and less division between countries as a result of those two wars. Now, again, we wouldn't choose to do it that way. This is not to say we should immediately go and have a war to make the world better. But war can bring, strangely, benefits. It can bring huge benefits to science and technology. A number of the advances in medicine that we take for granted were only possible because of major wars. Penicillin, the forerunner of the antibiotics we use today, was invented before the Second World War, but it was too expensive to develop. Nobody could afford to develop it until the war came. And suddenly, in a war, questions of expense aren't that important. If you want something that will keep your soldiers alive, if you want to be able to go on fighting, you need the new drugs. And so we owe a great debt, in a curious way, to the advances that were made in the Second World War. Things like transistors come out of the Cold War. The advances in computer technology are very much a product of wars. Again, this is not to say we should immediately go and fight a war so that we can have all these benefits. It's just that these are some of the unintended consequences. So where are we today? Well, we still have organized groups prepared to make war on each other. We still have the motivations for war, which I would argue have lasted and endured down through history. We still have the attacks on civilians. This is one of the features, it's always been a feature of war. Civilians have always been caught up in wars. They've been in sieges, they've been killed. The French used to have a thing which they called the chevauchée in the 18th century, where if you were trying to conquer your enemy, who was sitting in his castle, well defended, you went through his territories, killing all his farmers, all the peasants who worked on his farm, until he surrendered. So civilians have often been caught up, but what we have, always we have tried throughout the world to make rules that you don't attack civilians, that civilians should be left alone. And sometimes those rules have lasted. But what we've seen in the 20th and now, very unfortunately, in the 21st century, is a blurring of those rules. Civilians increasingly are seen as legitimate targets. Again, go back to the recent atrocities carried out by Hamas. And one of the Hamas leaders said there are no civilians among the Israelis. They are all part of the Israeli war effort. And that extension of war to see civilians as a legitimate target, expressed most brutally there, is something that we have seen increasingly in the 20th and 21st centuries. It was there in the First World War when increasingly those fighting tried to put pressure on the civilians. The British had a naval blockade of Germany to keep food from getting into Germany and other necessary materials, to try in part to persuade the German people they didn't want to go on fighting. It was more difficult in the First World War to attack civilians, but by the time of the Second World War, we had increasingly long-range aircraft. And so bombing civilians from the air became part of what both sides did. Terrorizing civilians became part of what both sides did. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was only partly about military advantage. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima in Japan in 1945 was to show the Japanese people they didn't have a hope, and that more and more of them would be killed until their government surrendered. And this has led to the mass killing of civilians, the types of attacks we see today, the assumptions that civilians are part of any war effort. And I think it is one of the most dreadful things that has happened. I think it will unfortunately go on. Now, we keep trying as a species to try and make rules about this. We like making rules. We don't always obey the rules very well, but we try and make rules. And there have been a lot of attempts to limit what happens to civilians. There are all sorts of rules about how you should treat them. There have been rules made about how you treat prisoners of war, those who are taken prison in war. And there are rules about what sort of weapons you should use. And these are signed as a whole body of laws. If you look it up, there's a huge amount, the Hague and the Geneva Conventions. And then you look at what happens, and when a war starts, it's very easy to break rules, especially if you feel that you have no choice. You're fighting for your survival. So I think we are going to go on seeing, in some cases, the old features of war. We'll see wars being started for the reasons I mentioned. I think that probably won't change. But what we will, I think, continue to see is the increasing spread of war to those who are not directly fighting in it. And we'll see what is called asymmetric war, where much weaker powers, again, looking at some of the terrorist groups that exist in the world and have existed, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, like Hamas today, like Hezbollah, will use the tactics of the weak, which are terrorist attacks. They will attack soft targets. They can't fight directly a war against the powers they're fighting, but what they can do is attack them in other ways, hoping that their publics will eventually want to stop. Because what has become increasingly important in war, it was always there, but what has become increasingly important is information, the information war. How do you get to the other side? And now it's fairly easy. The use of social media and the use of disinformation, you can put out immediately all sorts of increasingly convincing photographs, videos, and these are flooding the internet at the moment. There are things being put out by both sides in the current conflict in the Middle East, some of which come from quite different wars, some of which are taken from movies, but have a terrific impact. You think of how much time people spend looking at social media and how often they will believe in it. So I think what we're going to see is asymmetric war, the weapons of weaker forces using weapons against those that they hope to change the minds. You will see increasing use of misinformation and social media information. We will, however, I'm afraid, continue to see state-to-state wars that we had all thought had gone, but the Russia-Ukraine war has been in many ways a wake-up call. And so I think, to go back to Trotsky, we need to be interested in war. Sorry, it's not a very happy subject, but I think a very important one. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por su presentación. A continuación, el profesor Diego Repening conversará con nuestra invitada y se abrirá un espacio para preguntas.
Well, thanks, Margaret, for a very illuminating talk on this unavoidable topic, is it? And I was wondering about, well, I wanted to ask a question first, and then I'll give the mic to the audience so they can ask some questions about the things that you were mentioning. But I was thinking about this element that you mentioned about the war as an organized endeavor, right? That is something that requires quite a lot of organization, a lot of effort from states, from people at the end. And in that respect, how can war can be a gateway into the study of society, of not only war for the study of war, but war also, thinking especially that we have so many students of history here that are worried about primary sources, and you have to deal with data and so on. How do you think war can also be a gateway for understanding society?
Well, I think societies fight the sort of war. Is it on? I think it's on. Yep. Societies will fight the sorts of wars that they're organized to fight. And so if you have a very stratified society, if you have a small upper class and a much bigger lower class, the upper class will want to keep control of force, and they will tend to do the fighting or pay other people to do it for them. If you have a more democratic, equal society, then everyone feels an obligation. And one of the things that happened, I think, with the French Revolution and the ideas that spread from the French Revolution was that we are all citizens. We all own our state and our government. But the other side of that is we owe them something. If we're all citizens and it's our government and our state, then we have to defend it. And so it works both ways. And so I think societies do fight the sorts of wars they want to fight. But some of the things we learn from wars are things we apply in other ways. We are capable. We argue among ourselves a lot. We have trouble with elections. We can't always agree on what we want. But when we face great challenges like war, such as war, we can actually pull ourselves together. I mean, I think in some ways the COVID pandemic was like that people had to work together. And I'm hoping that this will happen with climate change, that we face such a challenge, well, an existential challenge, a challenge about our future existence from climate change, that we may do what we know we're capable of it. We do it in wars. We can pull together, we can use resources. As I said with the development of antibiotics, somehow expense becomes less important when you're fighting for your lives, when you have something that is absolutely essential. So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to give the mic
Buenas tardes, profesora. Muchas gracias por su conferencia. Quisiera hacer una pregunta respecto a la asociación posible de hacer de la historia de la guerra con un principio humano, pero principalmente masculino, y que también autoras importantísimas han cruzado con la crisis global que vivimos. La perspectiva de que, en el fondo, estamos todavía viviendo bajo la épica de Homero y de las grandes épicas occidentales de mantener el poder a través de la violencia con otros hombres, en el fondo, que mandamos a matar a nuestros hijos y los otros mandan a sus hijos para que mueran frente a nuestros hijos. Y eso bajo una perspectiva masculina.
Well, since you are a man, I can tell you, yes, I do think men are responsible for a lot of it. Well, there is a gendered element to war. And not in all societies, but in most societies, it has been the men who've done the fighting. We know there are examples of women fighting in the past. There was the group in what is now, I always forget the name, but it was Dahomey on the west coast of Africa. They called them the Black Amazons because they were bodyguard of the king and absolutely ferocious. And you have had women warriors. We know they've found tombs in Europe of women buried with full armor and their weapons and showing the marks of trauma. But they have been the very tiny exception. You know, we remember them because they stand out so much. And so why do we have this very gendered history of war? And again, we get into the problem of, is it biology or culture? Now, is it biology because the men are freer to move away? The women are more bound to well, if they are bearing children, they're bound by that. It's harder for them to move. They have an instinct perhaps to protect their children, which men may not have in the same way. We don't know. I mean, there is a biological argument about this, but it's also cultural. You know, for a long time in many societies, it was patriarchal. Women were not valued as much as men. It's, again, not true of all societies. And I think often societies which appeared to be patriarchal often had very strong women. You know, China, for example, was technically and legally a very patriarchal society. But in Chinese literature, including Chinese plays, you get an awful lot about the strong mother-in-law. You know, so that suggests that women actually had in their own way a considerable amount of power. But it is, and I think it is an interesting question. I can't give you an answer, but I think we need to look more at it. And I think there were expectations of men about what being masculine was and expectations of what being feminine was. Now, what's happening now is a number of armed forces are taking women in. Initially, they had them doing the behind the lines jobs, working in the offices, but more and more they're in combat. I mean, I teach every year in Washington to a seminar of mid-career military, and we go around the room and they tell me what they do. And the women will say things like, I'm a fighter pilot. One was a Navy SEAL, which is one of the toughest groups in the American military. So they're clearly doing these roles. It's not been easy. They have faced a lot of resistance from men. And there have also been real problems with sexual harassment. You know, this is inevitable because there are problems with sexual harassment everywhere in society. But, you know, it is a very important question. And I'm glad you asked it. And I think not enough research has been done on it. We need to know much more about it. It's beginning, but it's not been a topic that people have properly explored.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you about the role that do you think the international community and organizations such as the UN can have in this kind of war?
Well, this is something we've tried for centuries to do. You know, we have hoped, and there have been many writers who've written about it, starting with St. Augustine. How do we make peace? How do we keep peace? Can we have some sort of international rules? And I think it is very important. I mean, a lot of our history is this struggle between anarchy and organization. And after the first, there was lots of talk about this in the 19th century, you know, international law, even the word itself became a term in the 19th century, and institutions were developed. And the First World War was so enormously costly. Probably 9 million men died, we don't know. And a great many civilians died because they couldn't get food and they couldn't get medical treatment. We don't know how many died, but it is appalling. And so the League of Nations came out of that world. And the League of Nations was an attempt to bring the nations together to work together for the common good. It is seen now as a failure because the Second World War started. My own view is it in fact did a lot of good. And it did quiet good. It did things with the world, what became the World Health Organization. It helped to develop the International Labor Organization. It did a lot to try and stop arms trafficking, slavery, all those things which were taken over by the United Nations. And the United Nations came out of the Second World War. And again, it was an attempt to stop this hideous destruction. And the Second World War killed even more, possibly 50 million. I mean, these figures are very hard to get at, but it is, you look at the pictures of the destruction around the world, it is huge. I mean, cities completely flattened, infrastructure ruined. And there have been attempts to, the United Nations has attempted to deal with war. And again, we see it now as a failure. I think we still need it. I think if we didn't have some international body, we would invent it, because it is a place where peoples can talk. And increasingly, as we notice with Gaza, the United Nations is called in to try and deal with the messes created by nation states and by combatants. And so I think, it is an effort that we have to keep making. And as I said, more important than ever before, because our capacity now for destruction is so great. And so we need something. And there has been one proposal that's floating around is to get the world's great powers to come together, not to do good, but just to keep peace. So it would be like, China, United States, India, Russia, they don't have to agree with each other, but they might agree that they don't want wars breaking out because it would hurt all of them. That's a very limited proposal, but it may be the best we can hope for. I'd like to think we will continue to try and remove the causes of war, but that's very difficult.
Muchas gracias, profesora MacMillan, por su interesante presentación. Mi pregunta quizás no es tan histórica, pero usted hizo alusión a que la guerra es una actividad humana, ¿no? La guerra organizada, al menos, una actividad profundamente humana. Pero ¿qué piensa usted de que cada vez estamos viendo más que muchas decisiones en la guerra comienzan a ser tomadas a distancia, de manera tecnológica? Incluso ya se habla del uso de ciertas formas de inteligencia artificial en la guerra, y que la guerra en algún momento pueda ser iniciada por humanos, pero continuada por máquinas, ¿no? O por algunas formas de tecnología. ¿Qué piensa usted de ese futuro de la guerra que podría dejar de ser humano? Gracias.
Well, in some ways, we've made such an appalling mess of it. Maybe the machines will do it better, but I don't think so. I worry about this. I think, well, two things. You mentioned the distance. And yes, a lot of war is now fought from a great distance. The people who control the American military who control the drones that would drop, that would hover over Afghan cities and show where the bombs could be dropped, were sitting in places like California. And so we're very distant. They would see pictures of what had happened, the results of what had happened, and apparently some of them suffered a great deal for this. But I suspect for a lot of them, the distance made it easier to tolerate what the consequences of their action were. And I think that is a danger. I mean, one of the things I've noticed, because I've talked over my life to a lot of people who've been in wars, and those who've been in wars are very cautious about war. They're not fond of it. And they get they're not angry, but they get fed up with civilians who say, we've got to go in and fight them, because they know what war looks like and they know what war can do. And the second part of your question was about artificial intelligence. We already have autonomous weapons systems which could be set in motion and directed. But with the increase of artificial intelligence, we will have systems capable of making decisions. And if we know one thing about computers, and I think this is probably true of artificial intelligence, is they'll do what you tell them to do, but they may do things that you didn't expect them to do. And so, you've probably all heard the examples. You tell a giant computer to keep humans happy, and what they do is bury them all in the ground with a breathing tube and a supply of drugs, and they're happy forever. That you have to be really careful how you direct these things. And artificial intelligence has, and I don't understand enough about it, but it has the capacity to begin to direct itself. And then how do we turn it off? How do we stop it? And there have been conferences with representatives of a number of the great powers to try and put in inhibitions, to try and build in protocols to autonomous weapon systems, or to build in protocols to artificial intelligence systems, and none of the great powers have been able to agree. So we are on the edge of something that is profoundly disturbing, I think, not just for war, but for our societies.
Hola, por acá Natalie. Yo quería preguntarle sobre qué tan, ¿cómo es que se llama? La pregunta es, ¿qué tan comprometidos están los estados, las grandes potencias principalmente, con hacer la paz? Principalmente por todo lo que la guerra involucra, que es que las empresas ganan dinero, o que incluso después de la guerra muchas empresas que van a reconstruir también van a ganar dinero para reconstruir ciudades y todo. Entonces, ¿qué tan comprometidos en realidad están las grandes potencias para hacer la paz, digámoslo así? Porque se ha dicho mucho que en realidad hay muchas formas en las que la guerra en realidad beneficia a algunos.
Thank you. I think it depends very much on the nature of the regime and on the decisions made by those running the country. And I think a lot of countries don't want war because they know what the consequences will be. And if they have intelligent leaders, which is not always the case, they know that wars do not go in the direction you want. You cannot predict a war. Once you start it, you are in real trouble. Now, the question of the corporations in war, I think, is an interesting one. After the First World War, and even before, I don't know if you've ever seen a play by George Bernard Shaw called Major Barbara, but it's about arms manufacturing and about how people make profits from it. And there is an argument that the big corporations who make the weapons really like wars because they can sell even more weapons. In fact, for them, it's better to have a state of peace where you're planning for war or worried about war, because you can then sell to both sides, which is what a lot of the big corporations did before both the First and Second World Wars. The Ford Company actually got compensation from the American government at the end of the Second World War because the American government had bombed some of its factories in Germany. So I don't think corporations that make arms make wars. They make wars possible. But from their point of view, as long as they can get people to buy their equipment, and if they can sell to as many sides as possible, that's better. And in a way, peace is better for them, because once you get war, once you get major wars, it's much more difficult. You have to sell only to one side. The government will start telling you what to do. And so I don't agree with George Bernard Shaw and others who say this, that the big corporations are responsible for war. They help to make it possible. But often they find themselves economically worse off. And also, if they're living in war zones, their factories will be bombed. They will not be able to carry on working. The German factories, the great Krupp arms manufacturers, were devastated in the course of the Second World War. So I think, and to go back to your original point, why governments will use war, I think depends on the nature of the society. And I think democratic societies are by and large slower to go to war than dictatorships. And I think that's a good thing. Democracies do have to listen, democratic governments have to listen to their people. and they have to think about the next election, which I think keeps them a little bit behaving themselves.
Buenas tardes, quería agradecerle en primer lugar la comunicación y una muy clara argumentación que siempre es importante, por lo menos para mí, para seguir sus argumentos. Quería traerla de vuelta al ejemplo que dio sobre Suecia y cómo una sociedad había sido capaz de cambiar una cultura que la había marcado tanto en un momento y encontrarse en este momento en otra situación. Y dado que usted está con nosotros por invitación de Puerto de Ideas, que es un proyecto muy claro con la sociedad en general, y estamos hoy día en la academia, y ha mencionado el cine, la literatura, ¿qué es lo que podemos hacer desde este lugar para intentar cambiar las culturas más guerreras o menos guerreras, digamos? Pensando también que los gobiernos nos parecen siempre tan lejanos, ¿no? Pero cómo nos hacemos cargo desde este lugar de las artes, de la intelectualidad, de la academia, en potenciar más o menos culturas que estén a favor o en contra de la guerra.
Well, it's an old debate, again, like many things to do with war. What is the responsibility of the arts? And should arts tie themselves to political causes? You know, I'm not sure they should. I mean, I think artists produce what they must, and rather than what they should. Sometimes, however, artists can be enormously powerful in depicting war. I mean, we think of Guernica, the Picasso painting, which is such a condemnation of war and what war can mean to civilians. But we should remember that artists have also praised war. You think of those great paintings of battle scenes, and you think of Napoleon. You know, the picture of, you may have seen it, the famous picture by David, Jean-Louis David, the French painter, of Napoleon riding over the Alps on a great horse. It's a complete, it didn't happen like that. It was freezing cold. He sat on a mule complaining the whole time. He didn't go galloping up over the Alps at all, but that was the image that went around. And so the arts, I think, like the rest of us, are pulled this way and that way by war. I think all we can do as intellectuals and artists is be true to ourselves. And I think in the universities as academics, I think we need to explore war. We need to not, we see it too often, I think, as something that is an aberration. It happens over there, we don't like it, we don't want to think about it when it's over. And I think war runs through so much of our society and has affected us so much and is potentially there. I mean, I don't want to get, you know, too depressing about this. I don't think Chile is about to go to war with Canada, for example, or Canada's about to go to war with Cuba. But the potential for war is there, and I think we need to take it seriously and not see it as something that is somehow separate from society. I think we need to really understand this very deep connection. And I think there's sometimes a caricature of what the study of war is. I mean, I sometimes meet people who say, well, you just are interested in bullets and guns and battles. And I say, I'm not actually. That matters, but what I'm interested in is what war does to societies and what it means for societies and how different societies have been shaped by war and how they are affecting war. So I think there are a variety of responses we can have, but I think importantly, I think we must be honest with ourselves. And I think we should be very careful about glorifying war. You know, I think the artists who glorified it have created some wonderful things. I don't know, does Homer glorify war? I mean, the Iliad is one of the great pieces of Western literature. It's extraordinary, and in some ways it does glorify war. I mean, that's another thing I didn't talk about, but we have very mixed feelings about war. I mean, we often deplore it, we hate it, but look at how many books on war you see in bookstores, and look at how many movies are made about war. You know, we have mixed feelings, I think. We in some ways admire those who are very brave and go and fight. We deplore the wars, perhaps, but I think we also see something glorious in them. I mean, you know, like many things in human experience, we don't always know what we feel about something. But...
Una pregunta más para cerrar la presentación de nuestra invitada. Quería agradecer la interesante presentación y preguntar en la misma línea de lo que preguntó Milena y lo que usted respondió, acerca de si hoy en día que hay mucho mayor posibilidad de conocer las atrocidades de la guerra por los medios de comunicación, etcétera, se podría dar una oportunidad de estar más en contra de este imaginario más heroico de la guerra. Si ese conocimiento más real de la atrocidad de la guerra permitiría que la sociedad civil pudiera reaccionar y actuar, digamos, movimientos en contra de la guerra, conociendo que no es heroica como, ¿no?, el cuadro de Napoleón.
I think so. And I think that's always been the role of information in the arts, that it can show the horrors of war. And there's that extraordinary series by Goya called The Disasters of War, which are absolutely, he didn't dare publish them in his lifetime because they were so critical of war, and he was being paid by the king. So this was probably, you know, a good thing that he didn't publish them. But yes, I think the arts and knowing more about the horrors of war can help us not to glorify it. But there is so much now disinformation and misinformation on the internet, and you wonder how this is going to play out. And there is also something I find absolutely appalling. There's almost a sort of, there are those who want to look at the horrors of war. You know, there are people who have been looking online. You know, I remember when ISIS was beheading some of its captives, those got a great many views. You know, so that I think how do we deal with this, and how do we, you know, I think the trouble with seeing things on the internet, it all seems quite remote, and you don't actually think it's happening to a human being, and it is. And I don't know how we deal with that, how we challenge that view. But yes, I think we all have a responsibility to say war is not glorious. But we will be running against very strong narratives that run through history, that there is a glorious side to war. And, you know, it is, in some ways, I find it hard to imagine, and I admire the people enormously who do very brave things in war, you know, who will sometimes do things that save their comrades. And is that glorifying war? Or perhaps it's just glorifying a human spirit, which will do things for others. So I have no clear answer, sorry.
De esta forma finalizamos la tercera edición de nuestra Cátedra Puerto de Ideas-UC. La Facultad de Historia, Geografía y Ciencia Política y la Fundación Puerto de Ideas les agradece a todos y todas por su presencia y por supuesto agradecer a nuestra invitada Margaret MacMillan por su excelente conferencia. Un último aplauso.